My name is Zuzanna, and indeed I did graduate quite recently from the university in Delft. And I graduated with the architecture degree, but in my research, I mostly engage with the heritage and try to connect the ideas of the past and how they can be translated into the future. My slides are not going. Okay, we got it. Okay, so in today's very brief talk, I would like to share my thoughts, which are also part of my master thesis, on the future of village communities in Yuen Long district in particular, in connection to the Northern Metropolis project. So I'm still quite young, but I already gained some professional experience, and throughout that experience, I came to realize that many developers and even planners sometimes, they do perceive local context as a sort of obstacle or inconvenience while trying to realize this profit-driven projects such as Northern Metropolis. So especially in a context of Hong Kong, we do talk about destroy first and build later approach, which is implemented. And then there are the consequences of those kinds of projects, which are being dealt with mostly as a damage control approach rather than more sustainable and probably more economically friendly proactive approach. So today I would like to talk about two types of loss that those kind of projects can bring to its context, and this is the ecological and cultural loss. And I hope that throughout the presentation I'll be able to explain a bit how the natural and ecological context and also the losses, how they are intertwined with one another. Historically, but also potentially in the future, and hence how we can perceive them as a part of the solution to challenges that they face independently. So I will skip the introduction to Northern Metropolis because I assume everyone gathered knows quite a lot about it already. But thinking about the Santin Technopole, the plans has been released recently. We know that the current design overlaps with significant portion of 150 hectares of the local fish pond landscape. And we can expect that this will be reflected in degradation of the wetland habitat and also the loss in biodiversity. And I think it's worth noting that the loss in biodiversity does not only imply this particular area of overlap, but also will also affect other places in Hong Kong. So we know the ecology is a big system, so we have to look in a systemic way. One of the arguments from the planners to resume the fish ponds is their inactive status, and hence they claim that it implies the low ecological value. And it is true that indeed the fish pond industry is declining in Hong Kong, and the average age of the farmers nowadays is around 60 years old. However, I think that the quite interesting question here is to ask why is that exactly? So why those fish ponds are being abandoned and why we're facing the population of rural areas. And thinking about the villages which will soon become surrounded by the development, ask how urban expansion affects village communities and hence the fishermen who also live in those communities and maintain fish ponds. And then to reflect on the ability of local culture to change, adapt, and continue to exist or potentially perish. So in asking these questions, it is important to look at the challenges we face and then later the solutions in a system way, as the Professor Yang also mentioned. The current condition that we face in the northwest of Hong Kong is undoubtedly a series of conflicting interests, either between the developers or the green groups fighting for different causes, or even between the villagers themselves that have different views on how they should manage their rural land. So whereas the existence of those conflicts is easily visible, I think it is worth looking into the past and history of that context to understand better how those conflicts came to be and why are we in this situation currently. So my master thesis was focusing on Yuen Long district, and in particular, the Tung Tau Village Alliance circled here on the map. And I chose this area to engage with because, interestingly, this is a first location for the fish ponds in Hong Kong back in the early 20th century. But also this area has transformed very rapidly in a very short time from well, a rural settlement based on the fish pond cultivation and farming to the sort of fringe village situation. So nowadays, the area is both physically with its boundary, economically, and also socially intertwined with the Yunlong New Town development. So the nature of today's talk doesn't allow me to go in well, in depth into the history of the context, which obviously you can imagine is very complex. But I would like to give a very short summary of area's history just to illustrate how this concept of nature through the uses of land and how the people were cultivating the land, and then the idea of the culture through changing village function can be intertwined. So looking at the very first years of the lease, the majority of social and economic activities would take place within the village boundary. So the village would, let's say, have a high degree of self-organization and would provide a sense of identity and act as a sort of a lawmaking entity for the villagers. At the time, there would be no urban development nearby, and the majority of northwest area would be covered in freshwater rice farms. So this is actually something that I don't know if many people realize that the current landscape of fish ponds actually not that long ago, because even 100 years ago, used to be actually covered with freshwater rice farms. And at that time, at the beginning of the 20th century, we would only see very small patch of fish ponds, mostly, as you can see on the map, concentrated around the Tungtao village cluster. Then in the 1950s, we had a lot of changes in the economy and prevailing industries, also a post-war period. So it became increasingly hard to just sustain, for the villagers to sustain themselves from the farming. And many villagers left to either the city was dynamically developing at the time, or even abroad. So the village couldn't anymore work as a kind of self-sustaining entity, but it started relying on the land exchange for the profit. And now it was actually possible because of the political changes on the mainland China, so that many migrants from the China would come to Hong Kong, let's say, to escape the political implications. And that would also reflect not only on the village function and this exchange of the land for profit, but the migrants would also bring the new ecological knowledge and new farming knowledge. And that was the time when we would see the creation of gateway system. In the 1970s and 80s, we had Shenzhen, which was designated as a special economic zone. And then at the same time, we also had the New Town program. So in the area, we would see the Yunlong New Town and Tim Shui Wai, which were created, and they would bring a lot of significant pollution to the area. So actually, because of the pollution, both in the soil, but also in the water system, and for example, the Shanpui River, it would be not possible anymore to use gateways, which do rely on fresh water. But the farmers were forced to switch the kind of cultivation of land to the fish ponds. And so actually in that time, during those 20 years, we would see that the gateways decreased from 800 hectares to what you can currently see in micro reserves. So just very, let's say, yeah, just a very small portion of what we used to have. Another, let's say, challenge that was created by the new towns, or rather the opportunity, was the economic opportunity which came. So we had the growth in the population in the surrounding area, and many urban folks would start looking for accommodation in the rural places so that they can find a cheaper accommodation. And this is a practice that continues today. So this position of the village and let's say the new function of the village as a host for urban residents initiated the expansion of the village boundary and put those two groups of rural and urban into the relation of mutual dependencies, that is either in economic exchanges kind of day-to-day life, like, for example, sending children to school in the city, things like that. And that also started forming how I understand the kind of perception of the rural. So further, to allow for quick profit, many villagers in the past, as you can see, this practice of the land for rent exchange kind of comes from the past. But today, many of the villagers also decide to rent or sell their land to either developers or just to develop new housing, but specifically for the renting purposes to accommodate for urban residents. So this, in effect, decreases the ecological value of the area, making the excuse for the development, as I said before. And as we know, the development drives development, whether that's additional housing or the infrastructure and transport infrastructure. So with that development, we can see that there's a lot of relocations of the urban population, the rural population. We saw many protests as well in Hong Kong in recent years, where the development was pushing them away or shutting their local businesses. But there's also voluntary outmigration from rural to urban, which lowers this kind of cultural integrity and the bonds between the community, and hence the kind of incentive to protect their own heritage, the rural heritage, which again kind of ties to this natural landscape, closing the vicious loop of this nature culture loss. So as illustrated by this changing village function and uses of the land, we can also see that the area has adopted to loss for finding potentials in changing circumstances. Like, for example, this transition from the gateways to the fish ponds. And I personally think that this brings more of an optimistic outlook and suggests that we can look for those potentials in future changes of the area, and see them as an opportunity to create, let's say, new values and the needs in the area. Such thinking also reveals possible approach towards much needed preservation of cultural heritage in the area. As we know, like, there's a lot of interest in researching the green enclaves in the east part of Hong Kong. And while this is very important, especially for the educational reasons, I do think that there's a need to also look into the cultural heritage, which is represented by the villages in the Northwest, which might not be set in equally beautiful setting, which is debatable as well. But those communities are still very active, and they do sustain their traditional practices. So I think it's a great opportunity to allow them to continue to do so. But we often perceive the rural and tradition as equivalent with the past. And many of us treat rural as a kind of the weekend excursion, the curiosity. So I think it is actually important to promote new vision of the rural as a viable actor in the shaping of the future of Hong Kong. And maybe calling for the new village function as an interpreter between the man-made, the natural, the traditional, and the sustainable for future. Maybe also to attract the younger people to come and live in the rural areas. Hence, we need local projects which can balance this development, sustainable development, with the active preservation of cultural heritage. By which I mean, we can try to build the capacity in rural communities to ensure their continuity, and hence this culture inheritance. So that, as I mentioned before, if we have this cultural inheritance and sort of strong community bond, we can also make sure that the local knowledge, which is not only the cultural knowledge, but it is also local ecological knowledge and kind of understanding how to deal with the landscape, they can continue. I think that's very valuable. So to give maybe, let's say, a short note on how I see this could be achieved, I will quickly present part of my project. So while I was looking into the historical context of the changes and adaptations in New Lung, I focused specifically on the Tung Tau Village Alliance, as I mentioned, but even looking closer, I was looking at the Shan Pui village, and I will use it to illustrate my proposal. One of the very first observations that you can make while entering the village is just the sheer amount of empty plots and it's a sort of neglected old buildings in a more traditional style. And while I was walking around the area and visiting other villages as a part of the alliance, I also realized that it's not a separated case, but indeed many villages do face similar fates. So there will be a lot of plots which seem kind of unused and well, they're all in a decaying state. So I was explained by the villagers, which I met in Shanpui, that a lot of those vacant houses, they were abandoned back in the 50s and 70s. That is the time where many Hong Kongers would migrate abroad or from the rural to urban. And since many of them do not have enough financial assets to kind of renovate those houses, they are left to decay. But obviously, they would hold on to the right to the land as it's Hong Kong. So any piece of land is a valuable asset. So I took an attempt to map the village and categorize all those, what I call the rural voids, to understand the situation a bit better. And from looking at the plots, I was able to distinguish, let's say, 3 overarching categories. There's a big number of plots which are empty, so there's only a concrete foundation, but there's also a number of plots which still have remaining 1 or 2 facades. However, they do not have load-bearing capacity, speaking from the architect's perspective. And then we have quite a huge number of complete structures with load-bearing walls and the roof. And within this latter category, there's also a few sites, which actually in this particular village is a significant amount of 17 heritage plots. However, those are the grade 3 heritage sites. So there's not, to put it simply, there's not enough financial funds from the government to develop them. Hence, they are just being inactive. So some of those voids, they do need renovation and let's say serious work, but also some of them, they could be repurposed in a very short time. And in total, just to kind of put things into perspective, this is the plan of the Shanpui village, of the older part. There's also a more recently developed newer part, but focusing on the older one, we can see that 23%, a very significant number, of the original village built footprint is considered to be occupied by those disused plots. You can also see that since the village is based on a kind of traditional layout, many of those plots have similar sizes. And this also brings, again, from the architecture perspective, it brings the opportunity for either use of modular system or to develop, let's say, a single design which could address most of those plots. So in response, I was working on the management framework to allocate better use to those plots. And firstly, the plots would need to be comprehensively cataloged, since I was not able to find at the moment, let's say, comprehensive data that would state the ownership of those plots and let's say their construction state. So this categorization could be performed by either the village members themselves, as they might know the best the kind of local context. But I also suggest that there should be a sort of committee formed with members from the village, but maybe also some overarching institution, like, for example, the Countryside Conservation Office. Then obviously we would need to identify the legal owners of those plots and determine what is their intention towards the plot. And in many cases, it could be the case that the owner would not be found. As I said, many of them out-migrated very long time ago. So in that case, the land could be repossessed as a kind of collective village asset. So the proposal suggests that those empty plots can accommodate the temporary structures. And I say the temporary, but obviously then they could be developed into permanent projects. But I think the temporary measures are cheaper and they can be implemented in a quicker manner. to address the northern metropolis also challenges. So those structures, we can make use of already existing solutions. Like, for example, there's a People's Architecture Office in China, which is working on the plug-in house concept. So you would have those kind of prefabricated panels, which already have all, let's say, insulation and all electricity already wired into the panel, so that they are only assembled on site. And then the plots can be rented by the village residents, either the indigenous residents in the village, but also the outsiders. Obviously, as I mentioned, this kind of rural urban, let's say, a dependency is also present because we have a lot of, let's say, outsiders. So the urban folks living and renting in the village. And this is, again, the opportunity for further research, because there is no comprehensive data that states how many of those urban residents are actually living with the indigenous villagers in the villages. But from kind of pure observation and, let's say, the conversations, it seems like it's almost 40%. So it's a quite significant number and a quite significant change to the kind of original social structure of the village. So in those plots, the residents can rent them and allow for the businesses to be incubated so that they can come forward with small local businesses and test them and develop them inside of the village. And this is to create the economic opportunities within the village boundary, but also to decrease their dependency, especially the economic dependency on the urban. But I also see it as an opportunity for younger people to be attracted to the rural areas and to kind of change this perception that, you know, the rural is either something that you go and visit on the weekend as a little excursion, or it's a place where you can look for cheaper accommodation, but it should also be a place where new ideas can be created also by the young people, so that we can combine this young talent with the local wisdom of also aging population, as Mike mentioned as well. So it's the economic opportunity, but it's also an opportunity to bridge the, let's say, the gaps between different generations and allow for the continuation of the knowledge. So obviously there's a financial implication to the project. So for the whole framework to function, the user, so the resident of the village that would rent the plot, he or she has to pay the rent to this overarching committee that looks after the project. And that rent can be split so that some part, more symbolic amount, can be paid to the original legal owner of the plot, but also, sorry, but also a part of it can be accommodated for the revitalization of the heritage sites, like this one. This is a site that, as I said, it's graded as a grade 3 heritage site. It's on the main square of the village. And currently it is not accessible, and it's left empty. You can see it's overgrown a bit with greenery as well. But I think that with accommodation for additional fund from the village, and let's say the money generated from the plots, those heritage sites could be actually accommodated for the community facilities, so that we can have more kind of communal feeling in the village, and we can have a place where those bonds between the villagers are strengthening rather than being weakened. So I think this also goes to what Professor Young mentioned, also with the old school being adapted for the new use. So this adaptive reuse element is also quite important. So the framework that I'm proposing, it promotes this collaboration between different actors inside of a particular village, in my case, the Shankui village as an example. But I would also like to highlight that there can be an opportunity for, let's say, connections and collaborations between different actor groups to kind of form alliances, maybe also in reference to the Tungtao Alliance, which it still goes by the name of the alliance, but it's not a functioning collaboration anymore. So for example, again, with the Shanpui village, we can think of actors such as a small group of fishermen working on the local fish ponds. And that group could form an alliance with other fishermen in other area and work towards the modernization and better monitoring of the practice. And also, while I was on the site, I was privileged to talk with the Birdwatching Society, which is obviously also concerned with the preservation of the fish ponds. And they also mentioned that one of the reasons why the fisherman industry is declining is because it's not profitable anymore. And hence, they also proposed that, let's say, modernization of the practice and better monitoring. So also the exchange of knowledge between different fishermen on their practice could actually create more profitable business. But also with these temporary structures and temporary programs introduced in the village, we could allow the fishermen to carry out additional small businesses during the quiet fishing season. And as another example of potential collaboration between the villages, we can also use the very framework that I am proposing. So to fill in those voids, we could use the prefabricated solutions as I showed earlier, but also as an architect, I see that we have huge potential in the area to actually look into more sustainable material options. So for example, to the west from the Shanpui village, we have Lantau Tomorrow, which is the village known from the oyster farming. And currently with new kind of research in the biomaterials, we can learn that from oysters, we can also create building materials. So we can create those alliances between different villages who, for example, focus on the timber production. Some of them might focus on the oyster farming. Some of them, like Shanpui, have the access to the reed, which can also be used as an insulation material, for example. So in that case, we can, let's say, facilitate the exchange of the materials to support well, let's say, local businesses that are taking place in those villages. So coming to the end, I would like to quickly summarize the potentials I see from this project. I think, first of all, I think it's quite important to listen to the voices of the rural community and allow for the projects that are driven from bottom-up approach, so that the villagers themselves, there's a capacity, let's say, for them to create more opportunities within the village, but they can decide by themselves what those opportunities should be. There should be the emphasis on strengthening the bonds between rural communities. As I said, it all comes, let's say, to this cultural inheritance. So making sure that the knowledge is not lost, and in the context of the let's say, the natural environment, also this ecological knowledge of dealing with the landscape. I think we also need to look forward to shape new perception of the rural more as an idea incubator and a driver for sustainability, to render this area as more attractive to the young people. I think also the project tries to suggest that there's a lot of land in Hong Kong that can be developed, that is already, let's say, developed and could be used, so that we can maximize the use of existing plots rather than looking for new areas to extract from. And I think with all those things that I said, I think we should try to build more appreciation towards both the cultural and natural assets in the area, and hence shift this mentality of, let's say, prioritizing the economic growth, but we should see the cultural growth of the area as equally important in shaping the sustainable future. And as a last slide, I would like to say that I'm very grateful to be part of this talk, because I'm also a young person trying to learn more. So I'm popping my email at the bottom of the slide, so that if you have any insights in regards to what I said and you would like to share your thoughts with me, you are welcome to do so. Thank you.